Summer of 1916. The Eastern Front of the First World War is plunged into seeming immobility. Two empires, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian, are exhausted by long months of trench warfare. No one suspects that an event will soon occur here that will shake the foundations of military art and change the course of the entire war. An event that will go down in history as the Brusilov Offensive. A great victory that is undeservedly little spoken of today. An operation that saved Russia's allies and made the Central Powers tremble. On June 4th, Russian troops under the command of General Alexei Brusilov struck the Austro-Hungarian positions with unprecedented force. What happened next was a true military miracle. The enemy front collapsed along a 350-kilometer stretch. The Russian army advanced deep into enemy territory for up to 120 kilometers, liberating vast lands of Galicia and Bukovina. The Entente had not seen such a large-scale success since the beginning of the war. By the beginning of 1916, the Eastern Front had settled into a positional stalemate. After Russia's catastrophic quote of the summer of 1915, when Russian troops abandoned Poland, parts of the Baltics and Belarus, the front line stabilized. Germany shifted its main efforts to the Western Front, believing that the Russian army had long lost its offensive potential. This was a strategic deadlock that seemed impossible to overcome. The Russian Empire was licking its wounds, restoring morale and replenishing ammunition, which had been catastrophically lacking in previous campaigns. Austria-Hungary, weakened by battles but encouraged by the successes of 1915, fortified its positions, creating an echeloned defense with concrete fortifications, minefields, and a dense network of barbed wire. German engineers helped build impregnable lines, considered insurmountable for any offensive. But in this seeming immobility, a plan was brewing that would change the entire picture of the war. Russia's Entente allies desperately needed help. On the Western Front, a bloody battle for Verdun unfolded, where the French army struggled to contain a powerful German onslaught. From February 1916, the Germans methodically ground down French divisions in the Verdun meat grinder. Italy, which entered the war in May 1915, suffered defeat after defeat from Austrian troops in the mountains of Trentino. The Italian army was on the verge of collapse under the blows of the Austrian offensive, which began on May 15th. The Entente allies turned to Russia with a desperate request to launch an offensive to draw off some of the enemy's forces and save the situation. The Supreme Command of the Russian Army, led by Emperor Nicholas II and Chief of Staff General Alexeyev, decided to conduct a large-scale offensive on all fronts in the summer of 1916. The main blow was planned to be delivered by the forces of the Western Front, under the command of General Evert, in the direction of Vilno. The Southwestern Front, under the command of General Brusilov, was to conduct a supporting operation, distracting some of the enemy's forces. No one assumed that Brusilov's supporting strike would become the main event of the entire campaign. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Russian army had not yet fully recovered from the upheavals of the previous year. There was a shortage of rifles, machine guns, and heavy artillery. Many regiments were staffed with hastily trained recruits, but strategic necessity demanded action. Russia's allies might not withstand the pressure of the Central Powers. Delay threatened the defeat of the Entente on all fronts. In these difficult conditions, General Alexei Brusilov proposed a fundamentally new approach to organizing the offensive. Instead of the traditional concentration of all forces on a narrow section of the front to create a udarny kulak, shock fist, he planned to deliver simultaneous strikes along the entire front line, more than 300 kilometers long. This revolutionary plan seemed adventurous to many, but Brusilov was confident in its success. He understood that only an unconventional solution could lead to a breakthrough in the strategic deadlock on the Eastern Front. General of the Cavalry, Alexei Alexeyevich Brusilov, was an unusual figure for the high command of the Russian Imperial Army. Hailing from an ancient noble family, he began his service in 1872, participated in the Russo-Turkish War, and rose through all ranks of a military career. But Brusilov's main distinction from many of his colleagues lay not in his origin or combat experience, but in his unconventional military thinking. He was one of the few generals who understood that the War of 1914 demanded new approaches and solutions. For many years, Brusilov led the Officer Cavalry School, where he trained a whole galaxy of talented officers. It was there that his views on tactics and strategy, based on a combination of classical principles with innovative ideas, were formed. By the beginning of the First World War, the 60-year-old general possessed a rare combination of qualities: vast experience and openness to new things. Taking command of the Southwestern Front in March 1916, Brusilov immediately began developing a plan for the upcoming offensive. His approach radically differed from the generally accepted canons of the time. Instead of concentrating forces on a narrow section of the front, which was standard tactics, he proposed launching simultaneous strikes along the entire line of contact with the enemy. To attack not at one point, but everywhere possible. Brusilov himself formulated his idea. This approach seemed adventurous to many of his contemporaries, contradicting all principles of military science. But the general was confident. Only in this way could the enemy be prevented from maneuvering reserves and plugging gaps in their defense. The second revolutionary element of Brusilov's plan was intelligence gathering of unprecedented thoroughness. For the first time in the history of the Russian army, aerial photography of enemy positions was widely used. Pilots risked their lives, flying over enemy fortifications to take detailed pictures. Based on these photographs, accurate plans of Austrian defensive structures were created, down to the location of individual machine gun nests and wire entanglements. Each commander received a detailed diagram of the section they were to attack. Officers and soldiers knew in advance what obstacles they would face and how to overcome them. This was a radical innovation. Previously, Russian troops often went into attack almost blindly, without an accurate understanding of the enemy's defense system. Brusilov also abandoned another established tradition: multi-day artillery preparation. Instead of a prolonged but ineffective bombardment of the entire front line, he proposed short but exceptionally powerful fire strikes at specific targets. Artillery preparation was to last not several days, but only a few hours. This ensured the suddenness of the attack and saved precious shells. Another innovative element of preparation was the construction of training grounds that accurately replicated Austrian fortifications. Soldiers trained to overcome obstacles identical to those they would face in real combat. Such a practical approach to troop training was unprecedented for the Russian army. Brusilov understood the success of the offensive depended not only on the generals, but also on every soldier. Therefore, he demanded that all participants in the future operation, from corps commanders to privates, clearly understand their tasks. Every soldier must know his maneuver. This phrase of the general became one of the principles of offensive preparation. The secret to a successful military operation often lies in its preparation. The Brusilov offensive became an example of how meticulous planning and an innovative approach can change the course of history. In the spring of 1916, unprecedented preparatory work in terms of scale and secrecy unfolded on the Southwestern Front. In contrast to the traditional practice of the time, Brusilov ordered the creation of detailed models of enemy fortifications. Training grounds appeared behind the front line, accurately reproducing Austrian positions, with the same trenches, wire entanglements, and dugouts. Soldiers trained on terrain identical to where they were to fight. "Every company must know its breakthrough sector like the back of its hand," Brusilov demanded. Officers received detailed diagrams indicating all features of the enemy's defense. For the first time in the history of the Russian army, every soldier clearly understood his task in the upcoming offensive. Special attention was paid to artillery. Instead of the usual multi-day bombardment, which only warned the enemy of an impending offensive, Brusilov proposed short but exceptionally powerful fire raids. Artillerymen trained to fire at specific targets: machine gun nests, command posts, communication nodes. The secrecy of the preparation was ensured by unprecedented measures. Troops were moved to the front line only at night. During the day, any movement was prohibited. Special camouflage nets and false batteries were used to disguise artillery positions, designed to mislead enemy intelligence. In the rear, work was in full swing to create reserves of ammunition, food, and medicine. Field hospitals, repair workshops, and communication nodes were prepared. All this was done with the strictest secrecy. Another innovation was the organization of infantry-artillery cooperation. For the first time, infantry commanders were given the right to directly request fire support, without waiting for permission from higher command. This significantly increased the flexibility of battle management and the speed of reaction to changing situations. Even the weather was taken into account in Brusilov's plans. Meteorological stations conducted constant observations to determine the optimal time for the offensive to begin. The general understood that in muddy conditions, the operation could fail, and he chose the moment with pinpoint accuracy. By the end of May 1916, preparations were complete. 4 armies of the Southwestern Front occupied their starting positions for the offensive. The Austrian command, despite isolated alarming intelligence reports, did not expect a large-scale strike. The trap was ready to spring. The dawn of June 4, 1916, was unusually quiet. The 350-kilometer front line lay dormant in the pre-dawn mist. Austrian sentries, accustomed to the measured rhythm of trench warfare, noticed nothing suspicious. In the enemy trenches, routine prevailed: changing of the guard, morning coffee, weapon checks. No one suspected that this day would go down in history as the beginning of the greatest breakthrough on the Eastern Front. Precisely at 4 o'clock in the morning, the silence was shattered by a deafening roar. Thousands of Russian artillery pieces simultaneously opened fire along the entire front line. The sky turned black from shell explosions. The ground trembled under the blows of heavy howitzers. A short but incredibly powerful artillery barrage rained down on the Austrian positions. Just 2 hours, and the artillery fire suddenly ceased. In the ensuing silence, Austrian soldiers barely had time to emerge from their shelters when they saw lines of infantry rising from the Russian trenches. Brusilov had intentionally reduced the artillery preparation to a minimum. This provided the element of surprise that had been so lacking in previous offensives. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Russian infantry simultaneously attacked along the entire front. The vanguard moved not in a solid line, but in small assault groups, armed with grenades and light machine guns. They were followed by the main forces. This tactic, developed by Brusilov, allowed them to infiltrate through surviving sections of the defense and attack the enemy from the flanks and rear. In the sector of General Kaledin's 8th Army, Russian troops swiftly broke through the first line of Austrian defenses and by noon advanced 8 kilometers deep into enemy territory. The strike group of General Savich was particularly successful, sweeping away enemy fortifications near Lutsk. In the sector of General Lechitsky's 9th Army, Russian units forced the Prut River and established a bridgehead for a further offensive on Chernivtsi. General Sakharov's 11th Army broke through the front in the Tarnopol area, and General Shcherbachev's 7th Army delivered a powerful blow in the direction of Halich. The Austrian command was shocked by the scale and simultaneity of the Russian offensive. They were accustomed to the enemy concentrating forces on one sector and were prepared to redeploy reserves to the necessary location. But the blow came everywhere at once, and reserves were catastrophically lacking. By the end of the first day of the offensive, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The Austrian front was bursting at the seams. Entire regiments surrendered. Artillery batteries were abandoned to their fate. Command posts lost contact with units. Panic began. The situation of Archduke Joseph Ferdinand's 4th Austrian Army was particularly dire. Russian troops had broken through its defenses in several places and were rapidly advancing. By the evening of June 4th, the army headquarters had lost control of its troops and had no clear picture of what was happening. In the following days, the offensive developed with increasing force. On June 7th, Russian troops liberated Lutsk, a large fortified city considered impregnable. Austrian units retreated in disarray, abandoning weapons and ammunition. Russian cavalry pursued the fleeing enemy, preventing them from entrenching themselves on intermediate lines. By June 10th, the depth of the breakthrough in some sectors reached 50 kilometers. This was an unprecedented success for trench warfare, where advances were usually measured in hundreds of meters. Brusilov's tactical innovations proved their effectiveness in real combat. June 1916 became a time of triumphant advance for the Russian army through the lands of Galicia and Bukovina. After the first days of stunning success, the Brusilov offensive developed with increasing force, turning into a true strategic disaster for Austria-Hungary. General Kaledin's 8th Army, having broken through the enemy's defenses, rapidly advanced towards Kovel. The 11th and 7th Armies expanded the breakthrough in the center of the front. But particularly impressive results were achieved by General Lechitsky's 9th Army on the southern flank. By June 17th, Russian troops had completely liberated Bukovina and captured Chernivtsi, the most important administrative and cultural center of the region. Our troops entered the city to the ringing of bells and the jubilation of the local population, recalled one of the participants in those events. The residents greeted us as liberators, with flowers and bread and salt. Many cried with joy. At the end of June, Kolomia was liberated, a major railway junction of strategic importance. Then, Brody, Halich, and Stanislav fell. The Russian army advanced, overcoming the resistance of the demoralized enemy. By early July, the depth of the breakthrough in some directions reached 120 kilometers, an unprecedented result for trench warfare. The Austro-Hungarian army was on the verge of complete defeat. Losses in killed, wounded, and prisoners numbered in the hundreds of thousands. More than 400,000 enemy soldiers and officers alone were taken prisoner. Hundreds of cannons, thousands of machine guns, and huge depots of ammunition and provisions were captured. What contributed to such a rapid advance of Russian troops? First and foremost, the complete disorganization of the Austro-Hungarian defense. Brusilov struck simultaneously along the entire front, preventing the enemy from maneuvering reserves. When the Austrian command threw reinforcements to one sector, Russian troops broke through the front in another. The moral factor also played a significant role. The multinational Austro-Hungarian army, consisting of Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, and other peoples, did not possess high morale. Many soldiers did not understand what they were fighting for and surrendered at the first opportunity. Entire regiments raised white flags as soon as they saw our lines, a Russian officer wrote in his memoirs. Slavic units, Czechs, Slovaks, Galicians, surrendered especially readily. They did not want to fight against their Slavic brothers. The success of the Russian offensive was also aided by a well-established supply system. Despite the great depth of the breakthrough, troops received ammunition, provisions, and reinforcements in a timely manner. Railway units worked around the clock, restoring destroyed tracks and bridges to ensure uninterrupted supplies for the advancing troops. By mid-July 1916, the Brusilov offensive reached its climax. The Russian army stood at the foot of the Carpathians, threatening an invasion of Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the verge of military catastrophe. However, at this critical moment, Germany intervened in the course of events. News of the catastrophic defeats of the Austro-Hungarian army reached the German command in the very first days of the Brusilov offensive. The reaction was immediate and decisive. The chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, recognized the scale of the threat. If the Russian offensive was not stopped, Austria-Hungary could exit the war, which would mean the collapse of the entire Eastern Front. On June 7, 1916, at an emergency meeting at the Kaiser's headquarters, a decision was made on urgent measures to salvage the situation. Falkenhayn declared, "This cost proved to be extraordinarily high for Germany. From the Western Front, where at that time the bloody Battle of Verdun was raging, divisions began to be hastily transferred to the east. The first to arrive were units of the 10th Army Corps, elite Prussian units with rich combat experience. They were followed by Bavarian and Saxon divisions. By the end of June, 11 German divisions had been transferred to the Eastern Front, about 150,000 soldiers and officers with artillery, machine guns, and engineering equipment. This significantly weakened German positions at Verdun and on the Somme, where a major Anglo-French offensive soon began. In parallel with the transfer of troops, the German command carried out a complete reorganization of command on the Eastern Front. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian army was placed under direct German control. General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the most authoritative German military leader, victor of the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, was appointed commander of the combined army group. His chief of staff was General Erich Ludendorff, a brilliant strategist whose name struck fear into the Russian command. Austrian generals were removed from key decision-making. Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, commander of the 4th Austrian Army, which suffered the most crushing defeat, was removed from his post. A German general was appointed in his place. Austrian units were mixed with German ones, creating mixed formations under the command of German officers. Kaiser Wilhelm II declared at a meeting with Emperor Franz Joseph. This phrase effectively meant the end of the independence of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces. German engineering units immediately began to create new defensive lines deep within the territory. Concrete fortifications, minefields, and multi-tiered wire entanglements were built. Special attention was paid to organizing the fire system. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide crossfire in all possible directions of attack by Russian troops. In the rear areas, powerful artillery groups were created, capable of quickly moving along the front and concentrating fire in threatened directions. By mid-July, the enemy's resistance had significantly increased. While in the first weeks of the offensive, Russian troops mainly encountered demoralized Austrian units, they now faced elite German divisions. The pace of advancement slowed and losses increased, Particularly stubborn battles unfolded in the Kovel area, a crucial railway hub through which the entire southern section of the Eastern Front was supplied. The German command understood the strategic importance of this city and committed its best units to hold it. Kovel must be held at all costs, Hindenburg's order read, and the Germans indeed held on, repelling one Russian attack after another. To halt the Russian offensive, the German command used not only manpower, but also the latest technical means. Heavy artillery batteries were transferred to the Eastern Front, including the famous 420mm howitzers, nicknamed 3. Their shells, weighing almost a ton, could destroy any fortification. For the first time on the Eastern Front, chemical warfare agents, chlorine and phosgene, were used on a wide scale. German gas attacks inflicted heavy damage on Russian troops, who lacked sufficient gas masks. The enemy's air power also increased. German airplanes constantly bombed Russian positions and conducted reconnaissance. Specialized fighters appeared, hunting Russian reconnaissance aircraft. The sky over the battlefield, previously almost entirely belonging to Russian aviation, became an arena of fierce aerial combat. By the end of July 1916, the offensive momentum of the Russian armies had been largely extinguished by the increased enemy resistance. The front lines stabilized. The German command, at the cost of enormous efforts and the transfer of significant forces from other fronts, managed to prevent the complete defeat of the Austro-Hungarian army and stabilize the situation. The price of victory in the Brusilov offensive was truly horrifying. The human dimension of this grandiose operation extends beyond dry statistical figures, but it is precisely these figures that allow us to grasp the scale of the tragedy that unfolded on the fields of Galicia and Bukovina in the summer of 1916. The Russian army lost about 500,000 men killed, wounded, and missing in action. These were fathers of families, sons, brothers, an entire generation sacrificed on the altar of war. Behind each fallen soldier stood orphaned families, shattered hopes, and cut-short destinies. The enemy's losses were even more catastrophic. The Austro-Hungarian army lost over 600,000 men, of whom about 420,000 were taken prisoner. German troops lost about 150,000 soldiers and officers. Losses were particularly heavy among Polish units fighting within the Austrian army. Poland, divided among the warring empires, lost its sons on both sides of the front, a tragedy exacerbated by the fratricidal nature of the conflict. The fate of prisoners of war became a separate chapter of this tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of Austrian and German soldiers found themselves in Russian captivity. A long journey into the depths of Russia awaited them, to Siberia, the Urals, Turkestan. Many could not endure the hardships of the journey and the privations of captivity. Typhus and dysentery epidemics decimated prisoners in overcrowded camps. At the same time, the situation of Slavic prisoners, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, was somewhat better. Many of them later joined the national legions formed in Russia to fight for the independence of their countries. Russian prisoners in Austria-Hungary and Germany also faced harsh conditions of confinement. Hunger, cold, and exhausting labor in mines and factories undermined their health and took their lives. By the end of the war, many of them never returned home, becoming victims of illness and exhaustion. No less tragic was the fate of the civilian population in the territories that became the theater of hostilities. Villages and towns in Galicia and Bukovina changed hands, subjected to looting and destruction. Local residents found themselves between a hammer and an anvil. Both warring parties suspected them of espionage. thousands of refugees streamed eastward, fleeing the war. The roads were filled with carts carrying household goods, women, children, and old people. Many died on the way from exhaustion and disease. The situation of the Jewish population of Galicia and Bukovina was particularly difficult, as they were persecuted by the military authorities of both warring parties. Thousands of Jews were expelled from the front-line zone as, quote, their homes and property were looted, and they themselves suffered humiliation and privation. The Brusilov offensive had a profound impact on the morale of the warring armies. For Russian soldiers, the successful offensive became a source of pride and confidence after long months of retreats and defeats. However, the joy of victory was overshadowed by heavy losses and growing war weariness. Letters from the front increasingly expressed notes of fatigue and a desire for peace. For the Austro-Hungarian army, the defeat was a severe moral blow. The multinational empire was crawling at the seams. Cases of desertion and surrender in whole units became more frequent. The spirit of Czech, Slovak, and South Slavic units, who did not want to fight for an empire they considered a quote, was particularly undermined. The demographic consequences of the Brusilov offensive for the participating countries were catastrophic. Russia lost the flower of its youth, educated officers and literate soldiers who could have become the backbone of the state in the post-war period. These losses, superimposed on the overall casualties of the war, undermined the country's demographic potential on the eve of revolutionary upheavals. The success of the Brusilov offensive went far beyond a local victory on the Eastern Front. Its strategic consequences changed the entire course of the First World War, affecting the situation on almost all theaters of war. First and foremost, the Russian offensive saved the French army at Verdun from defeat. The German command was forced to urgently transfer 11 divisions, about 150,000 soldiers with artillery and equipment, from the Western Front to the Eastern. This critically weakened the German onslaught on Verdun, allowing the French to hold the fortress and prevent catastrophe. French Chief of the General Staff, General Joffre, personally expressed gratitude to Russia. The brilliant successes achieved by the valiant Russian troops had an immediate and decisive impact on our situation. No less significant was the influence of the Brusilov offensive on the situation on the Italian front. By May 1916, Austrian troops had launched a successful offensive in Trentino, threatening to rout the Italian army. However, the catastrophic situation on the Eastern Front forced the Austrian command to urgently transfer significant forces from Italy to Galicia. The Austrian offensive fizzled out, and the Italian army was saved from defeat. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy sent a telegram to Emperor Nicholas II. The brilliant victories of the Russian army saved Italy from imminent catastrophe. The Brusilov offensive also had a decisive influence on Romania's position. This country had long hesitated, unwilling to enter the war. The successes of Russian arms convinced the Romanian government that an Entente victory was close. On August 27, 1916, Romania declared war on Austria-Hungary, opening a new front against the Central Powers. Although the Romanian campaign subsequently proved unsuccessful, the very fact of Romania's entry into the war forced Germany and Austria-Hungary to disperse forces in an additional direction. Brusilov's offensive forced the German command to completely revise its strategic plans. Germany's initial strategy involved concentrating its main efforts on the Western Front to knock France out of the war and then turn against Russia. It now became clear that the Russian army retained enormous offensive potential and posed a mortal threat to Austria-Hungary. This led to a fundamental revision of German strategy. Chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, was dismissed. His place was taken by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, who were proponents of more active operations on the Eastern Front. One German general wrote in his memoirs, "The Brusilov offensive showed that underestimating Russia could lead to catastrophe. We were forced to fundamentally revise our entire military strategy." The success of the Russian offensive was also of great importance for the morale of the Entente countries. After many months of bloody battles with no decisive results, Brusilov's victory breathed new hope into the hearts of the Allies. English and French newspapers wrote about the quote that was once again in motion and crushing the enemy. In the rear of the Central Powers, the Brusilov offensive caused real panic. In Vienna and Budapest, there was talk of the possibility of a separate peace. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the verge of internal collapse. National minorities, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, saw in the empire's defeat a chance for independence. Anti-war and revolutionary movements intensified. Even in Berlin, despite strict censorship, alarming rumors spread about the critical situation on the Eastern Front. The food crisis in Germany and Austria-Hungary worsened as the fertile lands of Galicia and Bukovina were lost. The war economy of the Central Powers experienced increasing strain. The Brusilov offensive became a turning point in the First World War. It showed that the positional stalemate could be overcome with new tactical approaches and competent planning. The success of the Russian army inspired the Allies and forced the enemy to disperse forces on different fronts. Although final victory was still far off, it was in the summer of 1916 that the strategic initiative passed to the Entente countries. The Central Powers were forced to switch to strategic defense, losing hope of winning the war. The Brusilov offensive was not just a brilliant military victory. It brought about a true revolution in military art. The tactical innovations proposed by General Brusilov had a tremendous impact on the development of military theory and practice in the 20th century. His ideas are still studied in military academies around the world today. What made Brusilov's operations so revolutionary? First and foremost, it was the abandonment of creating a single strike force in favor of an offensive along the entire front. Before the Brusilov offensive, it was considered an axiom that for a successful offensive, it was necessary to concentrate maximum forces on a narrow sector of the front. Brusilov disproved this dogma, proving the effectiveness of simultaneous strikes on a broad front, which prevented the enemy from maneuvering reserves. This concept was subsequently developed into the theory of deep operations, formulated by Soviet military theorists in the 1930s. Vladimir Triandafilov and Mikhail Tukhachevsky, studying the experience of the Brusilov offensive, created the concept of a simultaneous strike across the entire depth of the enemy's defense. This theory formed the basis of Soviet military art during World War II. Another crucial innovation by Brusilov was the use of short but exceptionally powerful artillery bombardments instead of prolonged artillery preparation. This idea was later developed into the concept of the rolling barrage, the sequential transfer of artillery fire into the depth of the enemy's defense ahead of advancing infantry. German military theorists carefully studied the experience of the Brusilov offensive. Many principles applied by the Russian general were used in developing blitzkrieg tactics. They were particularly impressed by the idea of simultaneous strikes in several directions, which prevented the enemy from determining the direction of the main thrust. British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart repeatedly referred to the experience of the Brusilov offensive in his works. He believed that Brusilov was the first in World War I to apply the principle of, quote, striking where the enemy least expected it. This concept became one of the fundamental tenets of military theory in the 20th century. During the final stage of World War I, the Allies actively used the tactical methods developed by Brusilov. This was particularly evident during the, quote, a series of successful Entente operations that led to Germany's final defeat. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, in planning this offensive, largely relied on the experience of the Russian general. In World War II, the principles of the Brusilov offensive were further developed. The Soviet offensive at Stalingrad in November 1942, Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. All these brilliant examples of military art were based on ideas first applied during the offensive of 1916. One of the most important lessons of the Brusilov offensive was the understanding of the importance of thorough reconnaissance and operational planning. For the first time in the history of the Russian army, such a large-scale and detailed reconnaissance of enemy positions was carried out using aerial photography. This experience was adopted by all armies worldwide. The fate of the Brusilov offensive in the historical memory of various countries presents an astonishing paradox. An operation that changed the course of the First World War long remained in the shadow of other events of this global conflict. Its memory transformed, distorted, and at times intentionally erased, depending on political interests and historical circumstances. In Soviet Russia, the attitude towards the Brusilov offensive was ambivalent. On the one hand, Bolshevik ideology rejected the imperialist war as a fratricidal slaughter in the interests of capitalists. On the other hand, it was impossible to ignore the brilliant victory of Russian arms. In the 1920s, the Brusilov offensive was largely unmentioned, but in the 1930s, when patriotic traditions began to revive, the operation again attracted the attention of historians and military theorists. Alexei Brusilov himself, one of the few Tsarist generals who sided with the Soviet government, published memoirs detailing the preparation and execution of the offensive. During the Great Patriotic War, the memory of the Brusilov offensive was actively used to boost morale. Soviet commanders studied the operation's experience, applying its lessons in the fight against Nazi Germany. After the war, interest in the Brusilov offensive alternately waned and revived. In modern Russia, this operation is gradually taking its rightful place in historical memory as an example of military genius and the valor of the Russian army. In Ukraine, the attitude towards the Brusilov offensive has also undergone significant changes. During the Soviet period, it was considered part of common history. After gaining independence, Ukrainian historians began to study this operation through the prism of national history, emphasizing that the fighting took place on the territory of Western Ukraine and Galicia, and that many ethnic Ukrainians fought in the Russian army. In modern Ukraine, the memory of the Brusilov offensive is preserved in museum exhibitions in Lviv, Lutsk, and other cities, where artifacts from those battles, weapons, uniforms, photographs are displayed. Particularly tragic was the fate of the memory of the Brusilov offensive in Austria and Hungary. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this offensive marked the beginning of the end, a harbinger of the state's collapse. After the empire's dissolution, the new national states preferred not to recall this defeat. Only in the late 20th century did Austrian and Hungarian historians begin to objectively research the events of the summer of 1916. In Vienna, at the Museum of Military History, one can now see an exhibition dedicated to the Eastern Front, which includes materials on the Brusilov offensive. In Poland, the memory of the Brusilov offensive is particularly painful. Poles fought on both sides of the front in both the Russian and Austrian armies. For Polish historical memory, it is a symbol of the tragedy of a divided nation, forced to shed blood for foreign interests. After gaining independence, monuments and memorial signs were erected in Poland at the burial sites of Polish soldiers who fell in these battles. In the West, the Brusilov Hoch long remained in the shadow of Verdun, the Somme, and other battles of the Western Front. In British and French history textbooks, it received minimal attention, despite its strategic importance for the entire war. Only in recent decades have Western historians begun to give this operation its due. British military historian Norman Stone called the Brusilov offensive. Quote, American researcher Timothy Dowling, in his monograph, quote, notes that it was the Brusilov offensive that demonstrated the possibility of overcoming the positional stalemate that had become the curse of the First World War. Today, the memory of the Brusilov offensive is preserved in numerous memorials and mass graves scattered across the hills and plains of western Ukraine. In the village of Lopushna in the Ternopil region, a modest obelisk stands at the site of the Russian troops' breakthrough. In Chernivtsi, the historical museum houses photographs and documents from those days. In the Polish city of Przemyśl, there is a military cemetery where soldiers of all armies who fell in those battles are buried. These places of memory are silent witnesses to a great victory and a great tragedy that unfolded on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1916. The Brusilov offensive has long since become a historical event, yet its lessons and significance remain relevant in the modern world. This operation, conducted over 100 years ago, continues to influence military theory, geopolitical thinking, and the collective memory of nations. It has become a kind of bridge between the past and the present, a connecting link in understanding the nature of war and peace. First and foremost, the Brusilov offensive remains an unparalleled example of military innovation in a time of crisis. Modern military strategists study Brusilov's methods when faced with the need to overcome a positional stalemate in 21st century conflicts. The principle of distributed strike, the refusal to create a single main line of attack, meticulous reconnaissance and preparation, all these elements have entered the arsenal of modern military art. Even in the era of high-tech warfare, the human factor, to which Brusilov attached paramount importance, remains decisive. The geopolitical lessons of the Brusilov offensive are no less significant. This operation vividly demonstrated how the military success of one country can fundamentally alter the balance of power in an entire region. Just as Brusilov's offensive saved Italy and France from defeat, modern local conflicts have global consequences. Events in Syria, Ukraine, or on the Korean Peninsula reverberate worldwide, changing the strategic calculations of great powers. The Brusilov offensive also reminds us of the unpredictability of war and the danger of underestimating the enemy. Austria-Hungary and Germany considered the Russian army bled dry after the defeats of 1915. Yet it was precisely this army that dealt them a crushing blow. In the modern world, such underestimation of the enemy can have even more catastrophic consequences. The experience of the Brusilov offensive is also relevant for understanding the role of technological innovations in warfare. Brusilov creatively applied the technical means available to him: aerial photography, field telephones, new artillery techniques. Today, in the era of drones, cyber warfare, and artificial intelligence, his approach to integrating technology with classical military tactics remains a model to emulate. The tragic scale of human losses in the Brusilov offensive serves as a reminder of the price of military conflicts. In an era when wars are becoming increasingly destructive and weapons more and more lethal, this lesson acquires special significance. The million lives got in the summer of 1916 should compel modern politicians and military leaders to seek diplomatic solutions to conflicts. The Brusilov offensive holds enduring significance for the collective memory of nations as well. For Russia, it is a symbol of military valor and engineering genius. For Ukraine, a part of the history of its national territory. For Austria and Hungary, a reminder of the collapse of an empire. For Poland, a symbol of national tragedy. In an era of information warfare and historical manipulation, it is important to maintain an objective view of such events, acknowledging their complexity and multifaceted nature. Finally, the Brusilov offensive reminds us of the role of personality in history. Alexei Brusilov, a man of extraordinary intellect and courage, managed to turn the tide of the war thanks to his talent and determination. In a world where institutional and systemic factors are often considered decisive, his example shows that an individual can change the course of history. In conclusion, it can be said that the Brusilov offensive remains not only a great event of the past, but also a source of valuable lessons for the present and future. Its military, geopolitical, technological, and humanitarian aspects continue to influence our understanding of modern conflicts and international relations. By studying this operation, we better understand not only the past, but also the present, and thus gain a chance to build a more peaceful future.